Okay, today's lesson is lesson 7, and it's George Washington. We talked a few lessons back about the qualities a strong leader possesses. Take a minute and try to remember what some of those were. Did the words determined, honorable, innovative, personable, flexible, or humble come up? These were just a few of the personality traits possessed by a man well known as one of America's first and greatest leaders, George Washington. He was far from perfect, as you will see, but his response to the challenges he faced helped to form his strong character. Let's dive in and explore the part this legendary figure played in early America. George Washington was born February 22nd, 1732, in rural Virginia. His father, Augustine, was a successful farmer who had 3 children with his first wife before she passed away. He then married a woman named Mary, and together they had George and then 5 more children. When young George was only 11, his father passed away, and his mother and her children were left to run the family plantation, Ferry Farm. This newfound responsibility helped to form a lifelong quality in George: diligence. He had to work hard. After his father's death, the family didn't have the money to send George away to school as his older siblings had done. Instead, he received the rest of his education at home. That's right, the Washingtons were a homeschooled family as well. Washington studied many of the things you probably do: reading, writing, and math, especially geometry, which was necessary for his first career path as a land surveyor. Beginning in 1749, when he was only 16, he measured land and created maps in preparation for building. This was not to be a lifelong career for Washington, though. He soon joined the British military as a soldier and scout. He had several opportunities to learn how to lead a military company, although he failed many times and even led the expedition in 1753 that was a catalyst for the French and Indian War. In spite of failure, he was respected by many. Washington's courage and willingness to do whatever was necessary left him with a solid reputation. After a 6-year stint in the Army, he stepped down and moved to another family home, Mount Vernon, to return to farming. From 1757 to 1775, Washington worked at farming and improving Mount Vernon, a beautiful home set on a hill above the Potomac River in Virginia. This period in his life showcased his innovative spirit, and he made changes that were quite uncommon in the mid-1700s, abandoning the traditional tobacco crop and planting wheat instead, adding a mill to grind the wheat, and trying many new farming techniques. He worked hard on the house as well. He expanded it to many times its original size and acquired 6,000 more acres of land. Today, you can still visit and tour this beautiful home. For an activity break, it was said that George Washington studied manners and etiquette closely. In his youth, he copied the Rules for Civility. A booklet outlined 110 rules on how best to show respect and live a mannerly life. He didn't just read it, he took it to heart, and he wrote out his own copy of it. He was known throughout his life for his courtesy and integrity. Look up the manuscript and read this together. How many of them do you already do? Which ones need some work? And some may seem outdated and will probably make you laugh, but still hold true. You can find them linked on the resource page, so have your mom look that up. These years brought other changes in Washington's life as well. He entered into politics and became a representative in the English legislature in 1758, a position he held until 1774. He was a key figure in establishing the First Continental Congress. His personal life saw great change during this time. In 1759, he married Martha Curtis, a widow who brought 2 children with her to live at Mount Vernon. John and Martha, known as Jackie and Patsy, Washington was now a delicate and a family man. Spotlight on Martha Washington. Martha was a loyal wife and welcome hostess. In history, she came to be known as George Washington's worthy partner because of her devotion to her husband and industrious nature. When Washington was put in charge of the Continental Army in 1775, Martha worked tirelessly to keep the Mount Vernon plantation operating and raised both her children and later her grandchildren. Not only that, she was a regular presence at the Revolutionary War camps and spent many winters there. These camps were lonely places. However, at Washington's request, she spent about half of the war there, helping him with paperwork, entertaining officials, tending to injured soldiers, and even knitting items for them. She was a well-loved fixture in the camps. In the middle of the sadness and fear of the war, she was a comfort and inspiration to all she encountered. 1 Thessalonians 5:11 instructs us to encourage one another and build one another up. Martha Washington seemed to understand the importance of this role and exemplified the biblical model of encouragement in all she did, sacrificing her comfort for the good of those around her. Commander of Continental Army, June 1775 to December 1783. Washington had won the respect of his peers while serving in the Virginia legislature. His genteel and fair manner ensured the same was true in the newly formed Continental Congress. When the Congress decided the time had come to establish an army, Washington was called on to be the commander. This was approved unanimously. His military background and strong ethics made him an obvious choice, but what you might not know is that his identity as a Virginia native was a factor in the decision as well. Another delegate, John Hancock, assumed he would be asked, but the Congress wanted to show that they were united and that the fight for independence was for all the colonies. To show this, some members agreed it would be wise to ask Washington because he was from the large southern colony of Virginia. He accepted, and in June of 1775 became the first commander of the Continental Army. Let's take a look at some of the attributes that made him a successful leader. Qualities of a leader. Encouraging. Troops were loyal to their commander because of his strong leadership and his ability to unify the men in his command. He was empathetic and encouraging and showed an ability to boost the spirits of his army, even in the darkest circumstances. Flexible. The situation that Washington entered into as commander was completely unprecedented. There was no way Washington could have been prepared. He overcame this disadvantage by being able to change course rapidly when a challenging situation arose and by staying ahead of his enemy. Innovative. Washington was able to transfer a disheveled bunch of local militia groups into an organized army that defeated one of the most sophisticated, well-trained army in the world. He did this by thinking outside the box and being willing to try new things. Resilient. Washington was not always on the winning side. In fact, the Continental Army only won about half of the major battles in the Revolutionary War. Even when the Army lost much of its financial support toward the end of the war, he was still able to win the war under nearly impossible conditions. Washington made many mistakes, but he also learned from them and refused to give up. After victory in the Revolutionary War, Washington resigned his post as commander of the Continental Army in 1783. He hoped to return to a tranquil life at Mount Vernon. Although he had definitely earned it, it was not to be. The young country needed a strong constitution, and no surprise, Washington was called on to help. He was chosen as the president of the Continental Convention in 1787. This was not the time for retirement for George Washington. Only 2 years later, he was elected the first president of the United States. During his first term, from 1789 to 1793, He defined the role of president for all who would come after him through his humility, integrity, and impartiality. Because of his popularity, he was pressured into serving for a second fourth-year term. During this term, he worked hard to keep the United States out of war that was happening in Europe. He also had to deal with increasing partisanship with a political party thinks its way is the only way. Among this new government, something he truly loathed. His greatest hope for his country was unity, not division. He was still longing to retire and live a quiet life with Martha, but that was not to happen until 1797. When Washington returned to Mount Vernon, he enjoyed only 2 years of retirement he had so yearned for before he was taken ill. After coming in cold and wet from working in the rain, Washington became sick overnight and passed away only 2 days later, on December 14, 1799. Because of his strong leadership, sacrifice, and personal attributes that lent themselves to the unique role in the history of the United States, George Washington will long be remembered as the father of his country. On the Let's Talk About It, you have heard a lot about the character and integrity of George Washington. While all of this was true, he was not perfect, and only one of his conflicts that surrounded his memory is his legacy as a slave owner. He kept many enslaved people on his extensive plantation. As he got older, his views of slavery changed. He put it this way: I clearly see that nothing but the rooting out of slavery can perpetuate the existence of our Union. In his will, he granted freedom to all of his enslaved people he owned. Why do you think he waited until his death to emancipate them? Discuss this as your family. And this concludes Lesson 7 about George Washington.